In an interview with Newsweek on Monday, Alan Taylor, the director of last week's episode of Game of Thrones, said, quote, "It's funny, I did see one review where he just could not get past the airspeed velocity of a raven. You've got a dragon that's bigger than a Boeing 747 plane with 7 people riding on its back, and you're worried about the speed of a raven being believable?" Taylor was responding to fans of the show, myself included, who have been critical of this season's apparent time skips, plot holes, and unlikely coincidences. The main point of contention this week is how Daenerys managed to travel halfway across a continent in less time than it took for other characters to not starve to death in the middle of a frozen lake. I actually had another video planned this month, one about the medieval history of the Friars, but I realized I could respond to Taylor using a bit of medieval history, so it looks like the Friars are going to have to wait. Today, I want to talk about the velocity of an unladen raven, a medieval case of stolen identity, and, most importantly, pre-modern communication. George R.R. Martin loves to play with the limited perspective of his characters, and by extension, that of his readers. Throughout the books, characters will lie about their identity, people will be reported dead, and dire news is often carried on the wings of ravens. Sometimes characters accept the information they're being given, and sometimes they'll challenge it. But the important thing is, it's always an act of faith. Without access to modern journalism and electronic communication, the characters of Game of Thrones are at a serious disadvantage responding to things they haven't seen with their own 2 eyes. Limited perspective is baked right into the DNA of the series, and for good reason. Martin has set his story in a realistic analog of the Middle Ages, and in the real Middle Ages, communication was infinitely more difficult than it is today. The people of medieval Europe, just like the characters of Westeros, had a hard time collecting and trusting information. Travel was slow, expensive, and dangerous in the Middle Ages. It took days or weeks to travel between major cities, and a pilgrimage or war could mean leaving home for months or even years. Every letter had to be hand-delivered, and in the era before modern news, it was difficult to tell the difference between fact and rumor. I'll give one concrete example, the case of Count Baldwin of Flanders. Baldwin and his family deserve multiple videos of their own, but for now I want to focus on what's known as the False Baldwin Affair. In 1202, Count Baldwin of Flanders joined up with the Fourth Crusade, and while that crusade never made its way to the Holy Land, Count Baldwin wound up being crowned Emperor of Constantinople and then dying a prisoner of war, all without returning to Flanders. Baldwin almost certainly did die, but 2 decades later, a man showed up in Flanders claiming to be the former count, miraculously returned home after a 20-year adventure. Baldwin's daughter Joan, who ruled Flanders largely on her own, was not pleased about her supposed father's return, but the county's nobles and its city dwellers rushed to support the impostor. His story seemed implausible, but how was anyone supposed to prove or disprove his account? There weren't IDs or photos to prove his identity. And if Baldwin had survived, it's not like he would have left a trail of financial or medical records as he traveled. The only evidence available were eyewitness accounts and interviews, and there weren't many people left who remembered the real Baldwin. Eventually, Joan had to call in the aid of her sovereign lord, King Louis VIII of France, and the king summoned the impostor to an interview. The supposed Baldwin had trouble answering some of the questions about the real count's life, but he explained that he was tired from traveling all day and suggested they save the rest of the interview for the following morning. That night, the impostor fled the city, and the rebellion soon fizzled. There's more to the story, but the important point for now is how difficult it was to share and trust information in a world that was still centuries away from the printing press, much less photography and electronic communication. The nuances of the False Baldwin Affair are probably familiar to readers of A Song of Ice and Fire, which features a case of stolen identity left out of the show. By the end of the 3rd book, all of the Stark children have either died or gone missing, and the Lannisters and Boltons gained control of the North by dressing a commoner up as Arya Stark and marrying her to Ramsay Bolton. Just like the False Baldwin, there are few people around to challenge the identity of Arya's impostor, and there are no photos or documents to fall back on. That's just one example that travel and communication, or rather the lack thereof, play in the series. After I'd written most of the script for this video, I started rereading Game of Thrones for the 4th or 5th time, and I noticed a role of communication everywhere. In the first 30 pages alone, Ned receives a letter and immediately questions its authenticity. Catelyn has to assure him that it bears a king's seal and his handwriting. Daenerys muses about the homeland that she's never seen and barely understands. And Robert bemoans the difficulty of dispensing justice in a world that has to rely on eyewitness accounts. These are people who live their lives trapped by their own geography and technology. Everything beyond their immediate surroundings is unfamiliar, easily questioned, but difficult to disprove. If those rangers in the opening scene of the show had been carrying cell phones, then right out of the gate all of Westeros would have joined the audience in understanding the threat of the White Walkers. I'm being a little flippant, but this is a major part of the story. The whole tragedy of the Night's Watch is that they have no idea of what lurks north of the Wall, and when they do find out, they have no hope of convincing the rest of the Seven Kingdoms of the danger. No one's going to make the long, difficult journey up to the wall to confirm a ghost story, and the Night's Watch has no way of sending proof south. Except, none of that stuff is true anymore. If a raven can fly halfway across the continent in a day or two, then a boat can make the same journey in less than a week. Suddenly, the world of Game of Thrones is a lot smaller, which deflates 90% of the tension, just in this season alone. When Jon is trying to convince Daenerys about the White Walkers, the audience is left to assume that she can't verify his story, so their alliance has to be built on faith. Except if the wall is only a 6-hour flight away, she can go see the army of the dead and be back before dinner. When Sam argues with the Maesters about the White Walkers, we know Sam is in the right, but we also sympathize with the Maesters. What are they going to do? Travel to the wall and see for themselves? But if that's only a 2-week journey, they could. Or if ravens are faster than an Amazon Prime delivery, they could interview the Maesters of the North from the comfort of the Citadel. In fact, screw the Citadel. If travel is cheap and quick, every Maester in Westeros could travel to the wall and see the undead for themselves. Who wouldn't want to build a career on being the guy that discovers magic is real, and it wants to kill you? Okay, I'm going off the rails a bit, but my point is, scale is important in Game of Thrones. It isn't always. Other authors create richly textured universes, and no one cares that their planet-spanning city is literally impossible to feed. Or that sleepy little town with a new mystery every week has a higher murder rate than Detroit, Baltimore, and St. Louis combined. But in Game of Thrones, distance matters, because it limits what characters can know. If the world is small and travel is cheap, then the characters aren't constrained. They're just stupid.